Thank you everyone for joining us, and especially to Melissa for accepting giving this presentation. So I actually found out about Melissa's work when I read her papers on action from 2D animated movies. But today she'll talk about something completely different. So she graduated her PhD in USC in the Department of Computer Science, and she's now working at SDL, and she'll tell us about her work on creative assistant for story generation. The floor is yours, Melissa.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate you guys having me today. So everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay, just wanted to make sure before I get into it. So today I'm going to be talking about what I call the curious role of language generation in automated assistance for story writing. Most of this work or this discussion is motivated by issues I encountered during the time in which I did my thesis research. It's kind of a different type of talk because I'm not really going to give too many experiments, describe too many experiments, or give too many results. There's only one table of numbers here right at the end of the talk, but I'm going to focus more on motivating a theoretical perspective that I gained in the process of doing my thesis research that I hope to explore in the future and that I hope other people will explore in future research as well. So interactive story generation was the general research area that I explored for several years when I was at USC. Traditional story generation systems, which date pretty far back, story generation was actually one of the foundational AI tasks. So people have pursued it for a while. But for a long time, these systems, just like with other AI systems, they had limited natural language interfaces. It was really the shift to more data-driven NLP techniques that has happened in the last 10, 15 years and has really ramped up in the last 5 years with neural language models that enabled more interactivity in story generation systems. So we went from constrained language being elicited by user or being accepted by user input in these systems to more natural language. And along with that, going from more closed story domain systems to open story domain systems. And what I mean by that is closed story domain. These are systems that can only produce a very small fixed set of stories. So they only know about certain story elements, a fixed set of characters, a fixed set of locations, a fixed set of plot elements. Open domain refers more to stories. The system can produce really any number of stories. So it has a model of any story element that a user would want to introduce into an interaction. So this screenshot, if you're not familiar, on the right is of a very old, what's called interactive fiction system, Zork. And the interaction here is that you're presented with a story and then the user is asked to provide commands that dictate their interaction in the story, and then the story unfolds according to those commands. But you can really see where we started with interactive storytelling in this example, because the language that was accepted by the user was extremely constrained. So the system would only be able to process a very narrow number of words, and the words had to adhere to a specific grammatical format. Otherwise, the interaction would just stall. And of course, this is really an example where the system is responsible for telling the story, and it's just, the story is just unfolding according to user input, but the user doesn't really have a whole lot of agency in this case. So when I started working in this realm of interactive story generation, there was one particular use case that I became interested in, and this is the writing assistance use case. So this is what I ended up, the bulk of my thesis work ended up focusing on. And what I realized that this is a particularly interesting use case because it has specific features that mean that it differs, that make it differ from other types of interactive story generation systems, especially the traditional ones. So there's a pivot to focusing on the human author's objectives, in contrast to other systems where the story arises from the interaction between the system and the user, and either the system is dominant in telling the story or they have more of a equal role in the emerging story. When you're talking about writing assistance, really the author, the human author, is at the center of driving the interaction. So you can see the system less as an agent in the interaction and more as a tool to be leveraged by the human user or the author. And it's the author that controls the interaction and resulting story, like I said. So this writing assistance use case, this is actually something that I implemented an application for in the process of doing my thesis work. We called it Creative Help, we meaning me and my advisor, Andrew Gordon at USC. This is a screenshot of the interface. It's extremely minimalist. The user is just shown a text box where they can start writing a story. Really, they can write any text that they want. And they are told that when they want to generate a suggestion for the next sentence in the story, they simply type the command help. So if you have this story here about a cat named Opal who one day coming home got lost in a dark forest, at this point the user says, give me an automated suggestion for what happens next here. They type help, and it returns a suggestion. In this case, the suggestion is, and she was trying to make her way through the trees. So what was particularly unique about Creative Help is that because it places the user at the center of the interaction, and this is intended for the use case of writing assistance, the author has total control over what happens with the suggestion. So they might decide to delete it, modify it, add to it, however they would like to integrate it into their story. So, for example, they might change this suggestion a little bit to be, and as she was trying to make her way through the trees, a skeleton appeared. And so what I'm going to talk about a little later on is how this modification process can actually be used for evaluation of this type of system. But let me back up a little bit and start to talk more about the theory behind Creative Help. And a lot of this theory is actually not something that was totally known or totally that, the Creative Help work, the implementation or the development of it actually kind of emerged alongside becoming more familiar with the theory. So that's why I say a lot of this stuff that I'll be talking about today is something that I think can motivate future research, but it's really a perspective I gained while doing the work rather than something that was necessarily the foundation. So it's like I discovered some of these assumptions in the process of doing this research. So let's talk generally about theories of creativity as they particularly pertain to AI systems that can support creativity, in this case, creative story writing. So there's a lot of theoretical discussion about how creativity involves making random associations between ideas. And this is not to suggest that creativity is just full randomness, which would be, of course, a very chaotic way for any of us to think, but it's more of a constrained randomness. But there is this sort of serendipity involved in the process where connections between similar, seemingly disparate ideas just get discovered in a way that involves almost what you can see as luck. So there's a notion of divergent versus convergent thinking that's also been discussed in the context of creativity. Divergent refers more to the process of encountering these random associations, and so things making those connections between ideas that might not be obviously connected. And then convergent thinking is the process of examining those random associations and then trying to apply meaning to them and trying to make them more conventional in a way. So connecting them with knowledge that is more prototypical. And kind of analogous to that is this discussion of how creativity involves alternating between a process of engagement and reflection. So engagement is where you are immersed in the divergent type of thinking, where you're just brainstorming, thinking of all different sorts of associations. And then it's the reflection stage where you analyze those associations and figure out which ones are meaningful and interpretable. And I used the term serendipity as something that's involved in the creative process, specifically as it relates to writing. Writers need to be able to revise their goals when better ones emerge serendipitously through the creative process. So you never quite know what associations are going to come about when you're doing something creative, particularly when you're writing a creative story. And it's important to be able to accommodate that and go in a different direction than the one that you originally imagined you would go when you first started writing. And of course, just like I said, the caveat to creativity involving random associations, it's of course not full randomness, it's a constrained randomness. So there's an optimum between something that's too conventional or too reflective of convergent thinking and then too novel or having too much divergence in it. So something that's perceived as creative is not, of course, so novel that it's completely chaotic and interpretable. There is some conventionality that's imposed by the creator there. And it's that optimum that people perceive as something particularly creative. So that's just general theoretical discussion behind creativity. And there's also, of course, intuitions. People have natural intuitions about how creativity functions, particularly in story writing. So creativity is linked with surprise. And there is a hope that stories will break common sense expectations. It's, of course, much more difficult to write a surprising story than a boring one. And that's why storytelling is considered a creative task. So breaking those common sense expectations is actually something that is difficult from the standpoint of creativity. But of course, all writers, their advice to other writers is don't be predictable. And readers themselves, even the people that don't write, generally want to read stories that are surprising and violate common sense expectations, or the things that they think are most likely to happen in a given scenario. So George R.R. Martin, famous writer, gets at this by saying, nothing bores me more than books where you read 2 pages and you know exactly how it's come out. So we really have this value of defying reader expectations when we're talking about what makes a story creative. So with that in mind, we can start to think about, well, how does this affect the way we design AI-based tools for creativity and particularly for creative story writing? Well, you know, everyone who works in AI knows, and if you're particularly working in NLP, you know that AI systems struggle with common sense knowledge. So trying to embed common sense reasoning capabilities in AI systems is an ongoing challenge. And it's particularly been the focus of a lot of work in NLP over the last few years. AI is good at making these divergent connections. And if you've ever read the output of a neural language model such as GPT-2, you can get an intuitive sense for that, you know, a common in many cases, it's a complaint that this segment of this text doesn't seem to relate to this other segment that was written a few sentences back. So there is this kind of perceived element of randomness within the output of these systems. But what I'm proposing is that maybe this isn't just a bad thing. Maybe there is some advantage in this, and it's because people are already really good at common sense. With all these benchmark NLP tasks that we've seen in the last few years that are trying to really specifically probe common sense knowledge, we of course hold these systems to the standard of human performance. That's we're always trying to compare it to human performance, which is considered supreme, and trying to get as close to 100% as possible as people obtain on these particular tasks. So we know, common sense is very, very easy for people. And that's, again, connects to why it's easier for them to write a boring story, boring being, something that completely complies with common sense expectations, but it's harder to write a story that defies those common sense expectations. And people are not as good at this divergent. The typical person isn't as good at this divergent type of thinking that you can kind of see as related to randomness or making random associations between ideas, which is really at the center of creativity. So there's a possible paradigm here that I think we could consider when we're thinking about how to design AI systems for story writing. And it's that the AI functionality is responsible for the brainstorming aspect of story development, or related to the terms I used before, it controls the divergence and engagement components of the creative process, where you're trying to establish connections between ideas that would be disparate when we're thinking about it from a common sense expectation view. And it's the human author that establishes the coherence, or they do the convergence and reflection stage here, where they take the output of the brainstorming and then try to make sense of it and trying to turn it into some sort of coherent story. So it's almost like what's interesting is that we tend to see the lack of common sense reasoning or common sense knowledge in computers as a deficit. But what I'm proposing here is that maybe we can actually leverage it as a benefit when we're talking about things in the context of creativity support. And what I'll talk about in a few slides, it's important to keep in mind, is that if we are looking at systems within this paradigm, we need to consider what generation quality means in this context. So if you read a paper on a natural language generation task, people use the term high quality output a lot, and there's kind of a presumption of what that means. And typically what they're referring to is output that looks like it's human authored. It's judged by people to, the goal is to not be able, for a lot of these tasks, is to not be able to distinguish between computer-generated text and human-authored text. But in this paradigm, I think we need to look at this a little bit differently. High-quality output could be just what is helpful to the author. And that might not necessarily mean that the output is something that looks human-authored in order to be helpful to them in the creative process for storytelling. So I'll revisit that in a few slides here. So there's an article that came out about 1.5 years ago by Sigal Samuel, who is a fiction writer. And this was a really fascinating article because it kind of gets at some of the ideas that I just discussed on the previous slide. There's a particular quote in the article that is extremely interesting. She says, AI can be an incredible tool for writers precisely because it's great at defamiliarizing our world. The humanish language it generates can startle us into seeing things anew. So this relates to the point I just made about what should the output of these AI systems that are intended to support creativity look like. Well, maybe it's not just something that looks like it was human authored. You know, she uses the term human-ish and describes that that type of language is actually valuable from a creativity perspective. So the system here, and I should say she was particularly interacting with a platform that implemented the GPT-2 language model for doing text generation. So a fairly new technology. This sort of defamiliarization she talks about is, you know, something that it makes it different from human authored text, but she's identifying that this is specifically a benefit. So the fact that the story or the interaction doesn't proceed exactly according to common sense expectations is a huge benefit to interacting with these systems. So I thought it was really cool to see this perspective that I'm promoting, some of it also be reflected in someone who is a professional writer who actually has interacted with the types of tools that we work on with AI systems. So to make this a little bit more concrete, I want to show you how this paradigm shift might affect the way we examine these systems, and particularly the way we evaluate these systems. So there's something called the story close test, which was a framework that my thesis looked at in depth, and it's a really great, it's Nazreen Mostafazadeh was the main author of this paper, and it's a really great paper. It's a really great resource. The whole purpose behind it is trying to design an evaluation framework for probing common sense reasoning in stories. So to give you an example of what this resource looks like, it's a data set of stories that have been elicited from crowdsourced workers that are all supposed to reflect prototypical scenarios that a person might find themselves in, and the story proceeds according to what is most likely to happen in that scenario. So that's the instructions that authors were given about how to write the story. So here, I'll just read this. Alma was at a restaurant by herself. A guy saw her by herself and asked her if he could sit with her. They started talking and realized that they had a connection. She gave him her number and they started going out on dates. So along with writing these stories, participants were specifically told to write a sensible ending to the story and then a less sensible ending to the story. So what you could consider a correct ending and an incorrect ending. Really, they're being asked the question, which ending makes more sense? So that's when the system is applied to this task, that's what it is expected to do, is to select among these two endings which one corresponds more with common sense expectations based on just the information that's given. So when the system sees these two endings here that were provided by the author of the story, the first one being a year later they were married, and the second one being Alma wished she had never gone to that restaurant. If the ending that complies with common sense is the one that's being elicited from the system, then a year later they were married, the first ending probably is the one that's more sensible. And that, of course, was in this study validated by people that they were more likely to choose the first ending as far as the one that they expected to be most likely just given the information in the story without any other additional information. So that in this framework, we are trying to get systems to identify that first ending correctly. But what's really interesting, and this is something that illustrates this proposed paradigm shift that I'm discussing, if you change the question from which ending is more sensible to a different question, like which ending is more intriguing, then I would argue you would end up favoring a different answer here, and you would end up favoring the second ending. Exactly because it doesn't necessarily make sense based on what information is given. So Alma wished she had never gone to that restaurant. Well, that's not really explained by the story. And what I'm proposing is that actually, if you see that in the context of a creativity support system, if that's a provided output, it could possibly prompt the user or the author to fill in the gaps and explain, why did Alma wish she had never gone to that restaurant? So this is what, we would consider this surprising output. And as I talked about before, surprise is a feature that people identify of creative stories. So let's say if you are given that output in a system like Creative Help, then maybe it does prompt an author to then fill in the gaps here and say, little did she know he wasn't the man he appeared to be. And that's what stimulates you to write more of the story, as opposed to just the most likely ending, where it's harder to figure out how to additionally contribute to the story beyond that. So that's, qualitatively from my perspective, that's why I think that we can kind of shift this type of evaluation framework if we're trying to target the writing assistance use case. So I'm not proposing, certainly we abandon frameworks that are intended to probe common sense reasoning. The story close test is a great tool that we've seen a lot of progress on in the last few years. As far as the success of these systems, they're still not quite at 100%, which is human performance is very, very close to 100%. But all I mean to suggest here is that when you change the nature of the task to be something that is supposed to emphasize trying to elicit more creativity from the user, you might end up favoring a totally different type of output. So the last few minutes here, I'm going to return to the role of evaluation, and this is where I'll return to some discussion about the experiments about Creative Help and just give you an example of some experiments that I did with that system that illustrate possibly how we should think about evaluation for creativity support systems. So along with the design of these systems, the focus of the evaluation should definitely be on interaction with the human author, because it's the author that we're trying to support here. One particular thing is that it's really common in evaluating the output of natural language generation systems to elicit ratings from people about, which output here is more favorable, which one is higher quality. And that's a completely reasonable approach to evaluation. There's no reason that needs to go away. But the one possible shortcoming is that it can be difficult for people to explain their judgments of why they favor one output relative to another. So one alternative, and this is what we ended up doing with the Creative Help experiments, is to use implicit feedback to identify what is helpful to the writer. In particular, I mentioned that in the Creative Help interface, you can do whatever you want to a suggestion that's made. You can edit it however you see fit to make it desirable within whichever story that you're writing. And behind the scenes, the interface was actually tracking the author's changes to automated suggestions. So you end up with a data set as a result of the interactions that looks like this. You have the initial story that was written before the user made the help request. You have the suggestion that was provided by the system, and then you have the user's final modification that they applied to the suggestion. So we did one particular experiment where we had about 140 users interact with Creative Help for 15 minutes. And in the end, this yielded just under 1,000 of these suggestion and modification pairs. So we can use that for analysis and evaluation and in this case, what we did was look at how the features of a suggestion predicted the inverse number of changes to it. So intuitively, the more you can think of it as the less edits that a user makes to the suggestion, the more helpful they found it, or the more they liked the suggestion. So higher correlations here mean that those features of a suggestion are more helpful. So I'm just putting this table here, not because these numbers are important, but just to give you an example of this methodology where we did find some statistically significant correlations between linguistic features of the suggestion and the number of edits that people made to this. So these correlations mean features that significantly influence people to make fewer edits. So they were valuable or helpful features of these suggestions. And these features, these were all automated. So they were things like semantic similarity as measured by word vectors between the suggestion and the initial story that was written before the help request, the number of entities in the suggestion that co-referred according to an automated prediction with something in the initial story, the sentiment similarity between the suggestion and the initial story, and then some features that were just focused on the suggestion itself, such as the grammaticality, and it happened to be that the number of noun phrases also influenced what people did with the suggestions. So again, it's not, I'm not trying to highlight these features as the things that you'd expect to generalize necessarily to other systems. I'm just explaining the methodology of this particular evaluation approach. And you'll even see that these features probably don't seem to have anything to do with creativity, but you can substitute any particular features and they don't even have to be automated. As we did in this case, they can be manually annotated features. And just by finding these correlations, you can discover things that people find helpful in these systems. So my ultimate conclusion here that, again, I hope I'm able to pursue in future work, and hopefully other people as well will be able to pursue in future work, or at least shape their research according to, is that generation for creative story writing support requires a unique paradigm for design and evaluation, and one that's distinct from other generation tasks. Our focus should be on the objectives of the human author. So that is it. Hopefully the time worked out here. I think I'm right at a half hour, so it's good. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Melissa, for this fascinating talk. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. Vito here. I briefly wrote something in the chat, but my point is, so I apologize because I'm not an expert. I know I don't know much about what you told us. By the way, talk. Thank you.
Okay.
And so might be my questions are really simple-minded. So point is there any attempt to apply all this mechanism to poetry? What I mean with this is that there could be different creativity levels. In poetry, you might say, I just give you a simple sentence like I go home every day. And given that constraint, you build up a kind of poem on that. Is there anything already done on this? Or?
Yeah, definitely. There are other creativity support systems specifically for poetry. You should take a look at the work of Margin. I'm going to mess up her last name, but it's Gavinadava, I believe. I think I've messed that up. But she is one of, she was a PhD student of Kevin Knight, and they had a research program spanning a few years, specifically looking at poetry generation systems that are intended to support human authoring of poetry. So I think it's, and obviously there's some relation between creative story writing and poetry writing as well. You know, in both cases, you're trying to promote creative language. So I think some of the things I discussed here, particularly with the theories of creativity as they relate to AI systems, are applicable to those systems as well.
Okay, thank you. And the other one, if I may, and then I'll be quiet, is another system that intrigues me is songs. So you have, say, a melody, and you would like to write the lyrics. Is also there anything done?
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't think of a citation off the top of my head, but I did. Yes, I have encountered papers for that. And one interesting thing is that it's a hard task because there are additional constraints there, and that you have to both model the language aspect of the creation and the musical aspect and align them. So it's a particularly difficult challenge there, that you have those additional constraints that are a little bit more relaxed for other types of creative authoring tasks.
Okay, very nice. Yeah, it's a fascinating word.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm really passionate about this area, and more recently I haven't gotten to focus on it as much, but I'm hoping to return to it more in the future.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
You are muted. David, you are muted.
Sorry, I was saying there are questions by Frank in the chat. So if Frank wants to ask them.
If nobody else has questions, then I'm always happy asking questions. So first of all, thank you very much, Melissa. That was rather insightful. What I wonder with your paradigm, and what you have not talked about, is yes, I would fully agree that you have to look at what the author needs, but does that not also mean that you would have in the authoring tool a tool that is monitoring what the author is doing? But if you do this, would that then not mean that the system starts predicting and suggesting things the author is already doing, so that you then on the other side would look outside of the system? So what are your ideas about these two directions, and how should they be combined in your thinking?
Right. So the possible challenge here is that a system might want to actually push the user in a different direction than they find intuitive to go if it's actually providing some creativity support. That's the possible issue here?
That is a possible issue, but it could also be that the tool is clever enough to see that in certain circumstances, in contexts of writing, you go that way. So suggesting that way, but that means that the readers or the perceivers of the story would know, oh yeah, it's by you, so you go now this way. So the tool, technically speaking, should get you in the other direction. Yeah, but that is then the type of force of the experiment you showed, where you estimated where the changes are done. How would you then integrate that into a tool that it is still going towards, I try to get you to be different?
I see. Yeah. Okay. Exactly. Right. So you could possibly have some sort of model of what, because writers, who are they writing for? Well, I guess, they could be writing for other writers, but chances are they're writing for people who don't write themselves. They're writing for readers. So you could also have some model of specifically reader judgments of things that they prefer to see in a story. So yeah, it's interesting because you have here in the case of creative help, it's the writer doing the evaluation of this is what I like. But you could also have some sort of module that represents the desirable features that readers want to see, and incorporate that to possibly rank suggestions or to elevate suggestions that have those reader desirable features as well. And that could be something that you integrate to push them more in the direction of something that other people would want to read if you wanted to do that.
Okay, good. Could I ask one more question? It's a slightly different to that one. Your whole approach is very language-centered, which I think is not a good idea in the first place. But then there are other ways of telling stories. So with images, filmic. How do you think your approach or your paradigm is applicable to different type of media?
Yeah, so one of the last few sentences of my thesis made a reference to trying to incorporate images into creative help. And of course, I didn't get as far as trying anything like that. But yeah, I mean, with advances in these vision to language and language to vision tasks that we're seeing in the last few years, I think Microsoft even put out a system that wasn't necessarily for writing assistance, but it would take an image and automatically generate a story about that image. And that's absolutely something you could try to integrate into a writing assistance tool where, yeah, I mean, maybe obviously there's different preferences among people for different types of media. And somebody might have an image in their head and might not know how necessarily to translate it into words, but maybe they want that to be the basis for a story they're writing. Maybe it came to them in a dream or something. And then using that as a prompt rather than just text itself is absolutely something you could do with a tool like this.
Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any other question?
I have a question, Victor. Sorry, I can turn on my camera. Thank you, Melissa, for this really nice, really fascinating presentation. Very inspiring. I guess I just wanted to ask you two things, maybe. The first one is, so when you write a story, like right now we see you give a context and then you get the following prompt, right? So first of all, I'm wondering, when you write a story, usually you have to have an arc, you have to go somewhere, there's some sort of like direction it is taking. So would that be something you would be considering? So for example, I'm thinking, maybe you should go all the way, like maybe a last example on the Cloze test, that would be the end of your story. And maybe it would be the landmarks or something like that. Because, usually if you do yourself like a step-by-step random walk, then you can end up with something that is overall creative, but can also sort of drift away or go. And I think you said the human is good at like maybe keeping track of this coherence. Certainly a good writer knows how to do that. But I'm thinking, that I wonder if you had any thought about that part.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think one of the limitations of the creative help tool that we developed is that it's doing left to right generation, in that it's giving you the most immediate next sequence in a story, which is not necessarily reflective of how people, like you mentioned, of how people come up with stories. Part of that limitation is due to the fact that it's using a language model as the underlying technology for generating the suggestions. And right now, most of those models have focused on left to right generation. But there is, if you look at some of the work that tries to model stories at a level below language, so, there's things like modeling plot elements that maybe are not necessarily represented in natural language, but are represented through some formal notation. There's definitely been work on trying to do more infilling, meaning, you have some structure already there, and what you are trying to provide to the user, if this was deployed in an interactive system, is things that could be inserted into the middle of the story. So there is absolutely no constraint on doing left to right or generating the most immediate next segment of a story. I think it would be great to see more work, and I think we will see more work on doing things that are not constrained to any particular position. And even like the example I showed with the story close test, I had showed you the ending, and then my thought was that, well, actually the ending might motivate you to change the story, what's already given within the story. So not just, you know, then generating what happens after that particular ending. So yeah, I think we're going to see more work on this, and even in the NLP side with there is some new work on doing text infilling. So most text generation work has focused on this case of you have some existing text and you want to do continuation. But now we've been seeing some papers in the last few years where it's like you have some existing text and you know stuff is masked out perhaps in the middle of the text or at the beginning, and you want to fill in the gaps there. So that could be something you absolutely apply to a tool like Creative Help.
Yeah, thank you. And if I may, I have just one more question. I'm very fascinated by this idea of having a tool that helps with creativity. I just, maybe one question is, you mentioned at the very beginning the importance of giving control to the author. And so this part of control is quite interesting, right, in this AI field. I mean, we see a lot of problems of people feeling kind of dispossessed of like their capacity to do things, or we give them control, but, you know, they don't understand why we suggest stuff. Yeah. So I was also wondering, how do you address this question of control? I mean, control for me suggests that you have to have, maybe the system can give you reasons why it does something, or maybe you understand what are the levers that you can play with, you know, technically, and what the levers in the control theory, what those levers will do, in a sense. Right. If it, right now in NLP, when I use my systems, like I do one thing and it does something, I have no idea why. I mean, I just
absolutely
random.
Yeah. And I oh, sorry.
No, just that's it.
So I was using the term control to emphasize the fact that the users can then change the suggestions and adapt them, you know, completely delete them. This is just one aspect of control, but the reason I'm framing it that way is that a lot of interactive storytelling systems, the output from the system is more fixed. So in, you know, previous things, you have something that this is what the system gave you, and you just have to accept it. But so that's the way I was defining control, is the fact that you don't have to accept what the system gives you. You can just, you know, you completely override it. But yeah, like you said, there's definitely different forms of control. You can tune features. If you know you want to get suggestions that have specific features, you can try to explicitly provide users with the opportunity to select those types of features. And, you know, one thing off the top of my head that I didn't get around to doing, but what I thought would have been really interesting was to have people select what genre they want the suggestions to come from. So if they know, you know, this is a story about romance, or this is a sci-fi story, for people to be able to say, hey, give me suggestions that are specific to this particular domain. But also what you said about the reasoning, like a system providing reasoning for why it gave a particular suggestion, is also really interesting. And this is kind of a limitation of where we're at with AI and NLP in general right now, where it's, for some tasks, it's really easy to make predictions. And in a lot of cases, those predictions are accurate according to some evaluation framework, but explaining how the system made that conclusion or made that prediction is not so straightforward. So once we have more advances in that, I could absolutely see that type of thing being integrated into creativity support.
Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I have a question on the same line, because I think it's also a concern in the lab for the music team who are working with artists. What is very essential is that the artists don't lose their autonomy in their creative process. Right. And for example, you said roughly, if I may describe it roughly, that the AI could take the random part, and the human can keep the coherence, can work on the coherence, and etc. But you also say that the surprising part, random part, is what makes the process creative in a way. And so it looks like you leave all of the boring part to the human and the creative part to the,
Yeah.
to the artificial intelligence.
I guess I should say using the term boring might be a little bit misleading here. When I say, I'm saying it is easier for someone to write a boring story than a story that has a plot twist or some sort of element of surprise here. Yeah. But the role, I'm not suggesting the role of the human author is to take a strange story or a surprising story and to make it boring. It's more to try to filter out some of the more divergent associations that an AI system might provide, and then apply meaning and interpretation to them so that, you know, they're perceived as creative, but also perceived as meaningful as well. So not so much applying a boringness to it, but applying coherent interpretation to it.
Okay. And so I wondered, did you had the opportunity to ask their opinion about a user who used the creative help to know how they felt about the story? Do they feel it's like their story, or do they feel it's not totally their story? Or did you add their feelings about that?
I did elicit some qualitative feedback from people, and that was actually really interesting. And you could do a whole research study in and of itself, just examining that qualitative output. It really seemed to be that there was a lot of differences among people in how they approached the task and their attitude towards the system. So some people really, really hated the suggestions because, you know, they had a story. It seemed like they had a story that they wanted to write about, and the system didn't understand what the story was and wanted to take them in a different direction. But other people mentioned that they were more willing to be redirected by the system in writing their story. So I think it's really a difference in how people approach the writing task itself. And I should say that this particular population that did this task, it was a mix of people that I recruited, and then people on Amazon Mechanical Turk. But most of them, the vast majority of them, were not professional writers. So you might see a totally different effect if I had done this study with professional writers. But yeah, even then, I think that my theory is that there are definitely personality differences that influence how people interact with these types of systems, and whether they're willing to kind of play along with the system, or, you know, they want it to adapt to their style of writing.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there any other question?
I would have two more questions, if I can.
Sure.
One is, technically speaking, more a suggestion. So I was very happy about your last sentences, because technically speaking, you are pointing in the direction that indeed we would need some user modeling in the background. So I was a bit irritated about that you said, well, how willing are they to adopt their writing style to the system? It should be the other way around. No?
Right.
What I wondered is, that is probably now a bit far-fetched, but not too far-fetched. There are also interactive stories. So authors writing for interactive stories where they do not think about one flow, but several flows at the same time. So what would that mean for your paradigm?
Yeah. Well, so the first question was about I don't want to advocate that I think users should want to accommodate the system output. I think that all I'm saying is that there are differences in people's attitudes towards the system. Yeah. So, and that could even be a feature that you try to integrate. I mean, you could have something that allows the user to indicate how willing they are to have the system act according to more agency, as opposed to having the system adapt more to what they're writing about. I mean, that is just an additional feature I think you could model. So I'm not trying to make any assumptions about the level of adaptation that the system should make to the user, because I think that could be just another parameter that gets tuned. So I just want to say that, but then the question was about having multiple narrative flows then. So I think this could also be something that's addressed on the UI side. So, I didn't get as far as trying to model different types of UI design beyond type help. It gives you a suggestion, but there's a lot of different ways that you could set this up. And I think there are ways you could set this up that would be more accommodating of having multiple threads through a story. So there's a researcher, Elizabeth Clark, she's a PhD student at Washington, and specifically looked at this contrast between push versus pull systems. Push being what, excuse me. Sorry, sorry about that. Music started blaring. I think it's some application I had open. Just accidentally got triggered. So push being what the creative help system modeled, where you're just a suggestion is inserted into the story. But she also looked at a different design where you're writing and perhaps you have suggestions that pop up in a side panel, for example. So they're not being directly pushed into your story. It's more like they're there. And if you want to look at them, you can. But what I'm thinking, the question about having different lines of the narrative, it seems like for a pull type of UI, that might be more accommodating towards that type of thing, because then you can see for different dimensions of the story, you have different suggestions that are targeting that particular dimension.
Yeah, I was asking, so thank you very much. That's a very good answer. It's me thinking too. It is more, I wondered, because you started your talk with the question of expectation of the reader also.
Yeah.
And if you have now an interactive story, you would have to create different paths, but always assume what would it mean if I change from one path to the other with so the expectation of the readers are more in your face, so to speak. So if you only write one story, at the end it is more like the reader likes this story or they don't. In an interactive story, you would have, well, they can swap suddenly, and then they go from one to the other. But what would that mean for the authoring of these type of stories? Do you see my question?
So the question is, if you have just some fixed story that someone is evaluating, that is different from if the story is ongoing and people are making those judgments.
Exactly. So
interactively, yeah.
Huh?
Yeah. So that absolutely would affect how you. I mean, it's interesting because with the creative help experiment, we looked at quality on the level of individual suggestions, but you can also look at it as what is the person's overall experience with the application, where it's not just any one particular suggestion. It's you're asking them the question of how in general did the system contribute to their story, and we elicited that through the qualitative feedback, but we weren't looking at it on the level of combining all the suggestions, modeling the features of those, and then making some prediction about what was helpful to the author. But I think you could do some sort of aggregate examination of that sort as well. You having both, finding out what specific features of an individual segment that is being contributed by the author are helpful, but then also looking at the interaction overall. And that's where you could start to do kind of sort of more longitudinal analysis too, to see how do people's interactions with the system change over time, and if you're manipulating certain features, and how does that affect their overall experience.
Yeah, good. Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Is there any other question? Last question, maybe? So if not, I invite you to join us next week. We will have a seminar at 5 p.m. about data-driven approaches for microgrids by Annette Werf. And I invite you to thank again Melissa. Thank you very much, Melissa, and see you all next week. Beth.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Have a good night.